The rain fell in thin, icy sheets, blurring the streetlights into trembling halos of gold. Lina stood under the flickering awning of a closed cafe, her phone clutched so tightly in her hand that her fingers had gone numb. Every few seconds, she glanced down at the dark screen, hoping it would light up with his name. It never did. The night felt endless, like it was stretching itself just to punish her. Her boyfriend, Aaron, had walked away less than an hour ago, leaving her there with nothing but a single sentence echoing in her ears. "I can't do this anymore." They had argued before, every couple did, but this time had been different. His voice had been flat, distant, as if he'd already checked out long before he said the words. No explanation, no apology, just a cold goodbye and his retreating back disappearing into the rain. Lina had called his phone again and again until it went straight to voicemail. Each unanswered ring felt like another door slamming shut. She hugged her coat tighter around herself, trying to block out the memories flooding her mind. Just that morning, they'd shared coffee in his apartment, laughing about nothing important. He'd kissed her forehead and told her to be careful on her way out. Now she was standing alone on a deserted street, mascara streaked with tears, feeling like her entire world had collapsed in a single evening. The city around her didn't care. Cars passed, splashing water onto the curb, their drivers unaware of the quiet heartbreak unfolding under the dim lights. Lina had always told herself she was strong. She had moved to this city on her own, built a life from scratch, and refused to depend on anyone. But in that moment, strength felt like a cruel joke. She needed someone, anyone, to remind her she wasn't invisible. Her hands trembled as she scrolled through her contacts, stopping on a name she hadn't called in months. Victor Romano. The name alone carried weight. People whispered it in low voices, like saying it too loudly might bring trouble to their doorstep. Victor wasn't just a powerful businessman. He was a man who controlled entire blocks of the city without ever raising his voice. Lina had met him once briefly through a friend who worked at one of his companies. He'd been polite, calm, and unreadable, his sharp eyes seeming to see straight through her. After that night, he'd given her his number in case you ever need help. She had laughed it off then, never imagining she would actually use it. Her thumb hovered over the call button. This was reckless. Calling someone like Victor over a broken heart felt dramatic, even dangerous. But as another wave of tears blurred her vision and the rain soaked through her shoes, pride didn't matter anymore. She pressed call. The phone rang twice before he answered. "Lina," Victor's deep voice said, steady and composed. "It's late. Are you okay?" The sound of his voice broke something inside her. Words spilled out between sobs as she tried to explain how Aaron had left her, how she was alone in the rain with nowhere to go, how everything felt like it was falling apart. She expected him to interrupt, to ask questions, or to dismiss it as a personal issue. Instead, there was silence on the line, heavy and focused. "Where are you?" he finally asked. She told him the street name, wiping her face with the sleeve of her coat. "I'm sorry for calling," she added quickly. "I didn't know who else." "Stay where you are," Victor said, his tone suddenly firm. "I'm coming." The call ended before she could respond. Lina stared at the phone, her heart racing. Had she just made a huge mistake? Or had she just reached the only lifeline available to her? 10 minutes passed, then 15. The rain eased slightly, but the cold remained, seeping into her bones. She was starting to think he wouldn't come after all when a sleek black car pulled up to the curb, its headlights cutting through the darkness. The passenger door opened, and Victor stepped out. He wore a dark coat, perfectly tailored, and moved with an unhurried confidence that made the world around him seem smaller. His sharp gaze went straight to Lina, taking in her soaked hair, trembling hands, and tear-streaked face. For a brief moment, something dangerous flashed in his eyes. "Get in the car," he said gently, holding the door open. Inside, the warmth hit her instantly, and she let out a shaky breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Victor handed her a clean handkerchief without a word and told the driver to take them to a quiet location. Lina wiped her eyes, embarrassed by how vulnerable she must have looked, but Victor didn't seem bothered by it. He watched the rain streak down the window, jaw clenched. "He left you here," Victor said at last, his voice low. She nodded. "He said he needed space, then he just walked away." Victor's hand tightened into a fist, resting against his knee. "Did he know you had nowhere to go?" "Yes," she whispered. Silence filled the car again, but this time it felt different, charged, dangerous. Lina sensed a shift in him, like a storm gathering beneath a calm surface. She didn't know what Aaron had just set in motion, but she could feel it wasn't over, not by a long shot. As the car disappeared into the night, Lina stared ahead, unaware that one broken relationship had just crossed paths with a man who never tolerated disrespect, especially toward someone under his protection. And somewhere in the city, a man who thought he could walk away without consequences was about to learn just how wrong he was. The car moved smoothly through the quiet streets, the sound of rain fading into a distant hush as the city lights slipped past the tinted windows, and Lina sat in silence, her hands folded tightly in her lap, trying to calm the storm inside her chest while Victor remained still beside her, his presence solid and imposing, like an unmovable wall shielding her from the world. She had never been this close to him before, not long enough to notice the faint scent of his cologne or the controlled way he breathed, as if every inhale and exhale was measured. And though he hadn't raised his voice or shown obvious anger, something about him had changed since she told him what happened. A tension settling into his posture that made the air feel heavier. And when the car finally slowed and turned into the underground entrance of a private building, Lina realized she didn't even know where they were going, yet she didn't feel afraid. Not the way she should have, because after being abandoned so suddenly, safety mattered more than logic. The driver parked, stepped out, and opened the door, and Victor motioned for Lina to follow him inside, leading her through a private elevator that opened directly into a luxurious penthouse where warm lights, modern furniture, and quiet elegance surrounded her, making the chaos of the night outside feel unreal. And as soon as the door closed behind them, Lina's legs weakened, the emotional weight of everything finally catching up to her, forcing her to sit down on the edge of a couch as Victor poured her a glass of water and placed it gently in her hands, telling her to drink, his voice calm but firm, and she obeyed, taking slow sips as her breathing steadied. Minutes passed in silence until Victor finally spoke, asking her to tell him everything from the beginning, and though her instinct was to protect Aaron despite the pain he'd caused, the words spilled out anyway, about how distant he'd become, how the arguments grew colder, how tonight he'd chosen to walk away instead of fixing things, leaving her alone without even checking if she was safe. And as she talked, Victor listened without interruption, his eyes darkening with each sentence, his jaw tightening until Lina could sense the anger he was carefully restraining. And when she finished, wiping away the last of her tears, Victor stood up slowly, walking toward the window overlooking the city, his back to her as he spoke in a voice so controlled it was almost frightening, saying that no man had the right to abandon someone like that, especially not someone who trusted him. And Lina quickly told him it wasn't his problem, that she didn't want trouble, that she just needed help for the night. But Victor turned to face her then, his expression unreadable, and told her that when someone under his protection was hurt, it became his problem whether she liked it or not. Those words sent a chill through her, because she wasn't sure when she'd become under his protection. Yet a strange sense of comfort settled over her at the same time, and Victor told her she could stay as long as she needed, that one of the guest rooms was prepared, and that she was safe there, and though exhaustion weighed heavily on her, sleep didn't come easily when she finally lay down, her mind replaying Aaron's face as he walked away, mixed with Victor's intense gaze and the promise in his voice that felt like both reassurance and warning. Meanwhile, in another part of the city, Victor sat alone in his private office, the soft glow of a desk lamp illuminating his sharp features as he made a single phone call, his tone quiet but commanding, instructing his most trusted associate to bring him everything there was to know about Aaron, where he worked, who he talked to, what kind of man he really was, because Victor didn't believe in acting without information, and while Lina slept fitfully in the guest room. Unaware of the wheels beginning to turn, Aaron sat comfortably in a bar across town, laughing with friends, convinced he'd done nothing wrong, telling himself Lina would get over it, never once considering that the woman he left crying in the rain had reached out to someone who didn't forgive disrespect. And as Victor ended the call and leaned back in his chair, his expression cold and controlled, He stared at the city's skyline with eyes that promised consequences, not out of jealousy or possessiveness, but out of principle, because in his world, walking away from responsibility was the one sin that was never overlooked, and the calm before the storm had officially begun. Morning arrived quietly in the penthouse, sunlight filtering through sheer curtains and casting soft patterns across the polished floors. But Lina woke with a heavy ache in her chest, the kind that came from remembering everything all at once. And for a few seconds she forgot where she was, expecting to see the familiar ceiling of Aaron's apartment, until reality settled in and she sat up slowly, taking in the elegant guest room, the neatly folded clothes placed at the foot of the bed, and the distant hum of a city waking up outside. And though the room was beautiful, it felt foreign, like a pause between two lives she didn't yet understand. She changed quietly and stepped into the hallway, following the low murmur of voices until she reached the open kitchen where Victor stood speaking to someone on his phone, his tone calm but edged with authority. And though he ended the call the moment he noticed her, Lina sensed immediately that things were already moving beyond her control, and that realization made her uneasy. Victor greeted her politely, offering breakfast as if the night before hadn't ended with unspoken threats and simmering anger, and she thanked him, trying to act normal as they sat across from each other at the long marble counter, the silence between them filled with questions she didn't know how to ask. And finally she told him she'd leave later that day, that she didn't want to impose, that she could stay with a friend until she figured things out. But Victor looked at her steadily and said there was no rush, that she should take time to breathe and think, because rushed decisions often led to regret. And though his words were gentle, the certainty behind them made it clear this wasn't just advice. It was a boundary. Lina nodded, pushing food around her plate, her appetite gone, her thoughts tangled between guilt for involving him and relief that someone cared enough to step in. And after breakfast, Victor left for work, assuring her she was free to move around and that his staff would help with anything she needed. And once he was gone, the penthouse felt even larger, quieter, as Lina wandered onto the balcony and stared out at the city, wondering how her life had shifted so drastically in less than 12 hours. She replayed the relationship in her mind, questioning every moment, every sign she might have missed, and though part of her wanted to blame herself, another part, the quieter, stronger part, knew that no matter what had gone wrong, no one deserved to be abandoned without care or concern. Across town, Aaron woke late with a dull headache and a phone full of missed notifications from coworkers, but none from Lina. And instead of feeling relieved, a strange irritation settled in, because he'd expected at least one desperate message, one emotional plea that would confirm he still mattered. And when it didn't come, he shrugged it off, convincing himself she was being dramatic and would calm down eventually, unaware that Victor's people were already watching him from a distance. Quietly documenting his routine, his habits, his careless confidence. By afternoon, Victor sat in a private meeting room overlooking the river as his associate laid out everything they'd learned, speaking in low, precise tones about Aaron's job, his financial struggles, his recent behavior, and the pattern of avoidance and irresponsibility that had followed him for years. And Victor listened intently, his expression unreadable, absorbing every detail not with the intent to destroy a man, but to understand him, because power, in Victor's world, was always rooted in knowledge. And as the report ended, he dismissed his associate with a nod, already forming a plan that didn't involve violence or chaos, but something far more unsettling: accountability. Later that evening, Lina received a message from Aaron for the first time since the breakup. A short, casual text asking if she was okay and suggesting they talk later, and the simplicity of it made her chest tighten with anger and disbelief, because he had left her alone in the rain and now acted as if nothing serious had happened. And though her fingers hovered over the screen, ready to respond, she hesitated, realizing that answering too quickly would only pull her back into the same pattern of being the one who cared more. And instead, she set the phone down, choosing silence for once. When Victor returned that night, he found Lina sitting on the couch, lost in thought, and though she didn't mention the message, he seemed to sense the shift in her, telling her quietly that sometimes silence was the most powerful response, because it forced people to face themselves without distractions. And Lina looked at him then, seeing not just a powerful man, but someone who understood loss and disappointment in a way words couldn't explain. And for the first time since the breakup, she felt something unfamiliar stirring beneath the pain. Not hope, exactly, but the beginning of clarity. As the city lights flickered on and the night settled in once more, Lina stood at the edge of a new chapter, unaware of how deeply Victor's involvement would change her life, and how the man who walked away so easily was about to discover that some choices followed you long after you thought the story was over. The days that followed unfolded with an uneasy calm, the kind that felt deceptive, as if something powerful was moving quietly beneath the surface, and Lina began to settle into a strange routine inside Victor's world, waking early, drinking coffee while watching the city stretch itself awake, and trying to rebuild a sense of self that had been shaken by one careless goodbye. Yet no matter how peaceful the penthouse felt, she couldn't escape the awareness that she was standing too close to forces far larger than her broken relationship. Because Victor's life was built on influence, control, and consequences, and even when he spoke gently to her, there was always the subtle reminder that he was a man accustomed to being obeyed. One afternoon, Lina decided to step out alone, needing air and independence, and though Victor didn't forbid it, his security quietly followed at a distance, a fact she noticed only when she caught the same man reflected twice in shop windows. And while it unsettled her at first, she understood it wasn't about control. It was about protection, and that realization stirred conflicting emotions she wasn't ready to define. Meanwhile, Aaron's world began to shift in small but unsettling ways, starting with a sudden meeting request from his boss that ended with warnings about missed deadlines and rumors of a potential restructuring. Then a bank notification about a delayed transaction that left him short on rent. And later, a canceled job interview he'd been counting on, each incident minor on its own, yet together forming a pattern that gnawed at his confidence. And as frustration mounted, his thoughts drifted back to Lina, not with remorse, but with irritation, because deep down he sensed that since the night he walked away, luck had quietly abandoned him. That same evening, Lina finally agreed to have dinner with Victor, not as a favor or obligation, but as a way to thank him. And as they sat across from each other in a private dining room overlooking the city, conversation flowed more naturally than she expected, drifting from books to travel to the strange ways people drifted apart without meaning to. And Victor spoke little about himself, yet when he did, his words carried weight, revealing a man who valued loyalty above all else because he had seen what betrayal could destroy. And Lina listened, realizing that his anger over her situation wasn't rooted in jealousy or desire, but in a deeply ingrained belief that abandonment was the ultimate disrespect. Later that night, Lina's phone buzzed again with a message from Aaron, this one longer, apologetic in tone, claiming he'd been overwhelmed, that he hadn't meant to hurt her, and that maybe they could meet to talk things through. And as she read it, she felt the familiar pull of history tug at her heart. But this time, instead of responding with emotion, she handed the phone to Victor, asking quietly what he thought, and though he didn't read the message aloud, his eyes hardened as he scanned the words. Handing it back and telling her the choice was hers alone, but adding that apologies meant nothing without changed behavior, and that true regret showed itself through action, not convenience. Lina nodded, realizing that for the first time, someone wasn't trying to decide for her, but was instead giving her the tools to decide for herself. And after a long moment, she typed a brief response to Aaron, telling him she needed space and that she wasn't ready to talk. And as she sent it, a surprising sense of relief washed over her, like she had finally closed a door that had been swinging open and shut for too long. Across town, Aaron stared at his phone in disbelief, anger flaring as rejection replaced the control he once took for granted. And when he slammed the phone down, blaming Lina for being dramatic and ungrateful, he didn't notice the quiet way his world continued to tighten around him, opportunities slipping away, connections going cold, until the city that once felt full of options began to feel claustrophobic. Back at the penthouse, Victor stood alone on the balcony late into the night, the cool air brushing against his face as he made another call, this one brief, instructing his associate to stop applying pressure and simply let things unfold. Because the point was never destruction, but revelation, and some people needed to face the consequences of their own choices without interference to truly understand them. And as he ended the call, he glanced back inside where Lina sat reading quietly, her posture more relaxed than it had been in days. And in that moment, Victor felt a rare sense of certainty. Not about what he wanted, but about what he would not allow. And as the city slept beneath a blanket of lights, the distance between Lina and her past grew wider, while the man who walked away began to realize that some exits changed the entire direction of your life, whether you were ready for it or not. The shift inside Lina became noticeable even to herself, not as a sudden transformation, but as a quiet strengthening, like a spine slowly straightening after being bent for too long. And each morning she woke with a little less weight on her chest, a little more clarity in her thoughts, finding comfort in small routines, walking on the balcony at sunrise, writing in a notebook she'd abandoned months ago, and allowing herself to imagine a future that didn't revolve around fixing someone who never learned how to stay. Victor observed this change from a distance, never interfering, never pushing, yet always present in a way that felt deliberate and protective. And though their conversations remained respectful and measured, there was an unspoken understanding growing between them, built not on romance, but on mutual recognition of strength shaped by hardship. Meanwhile, Aaron's situation continued its slow unraveling, his confidence eroding as his boss informed him that his position was being reviewed. His landlord left increasingly urgent voicemails, and friends who once laughed beside him now avoided his calls, tired of his complaints and excuses. And for the first time, the possibility that he had misjudged everything began to creep into his mind, because Lina's silence felt louder than any argument they'd ever had, forcing him to confront the uncomfortable truth that she might actually be moving on. One afternoon, unable to bear the uncertainty any longer, Aaron showed up unannounced at Lina's old apartment, only to find the door locked and a neighbor informing him she hadn't been seen in days. And panic set in as his thoughts raced, imagining scenarios he couldn't control, realizing too late how deeply he'd relied on her presence as emotional insurance. Back at the penthouse, Lina received a call from her sister, and as they talked, Lina found herself recounting the breakup without tears for the first time, her voice steady as she explained how she'd been left alone, and how that moment had forced her to confront years of compromise she'd mistaken for love. And when she hung up, she felt lighter, as if speaking the truth out loud had loosened the final knots binding her to the past. Victor, watching her from across the room, recognized that moment instantly, because he had seen it before in people who survived betrayal, the moment when pain stopped defining them and began instructing them instead. And that evening, he invited Lina to accompany him to a charity gala, not as an escape or distraction, but as a statement, offering her the choice without pressure. And when she agreed, stepping into an elegant dress provided by his staff, she hardly recognized the woman reflected back at her, composed, confident, and no longer shrinking herself to fit someone else's comfort. The event itself unfolded like a carefully choreographed scene, powerful figures exchanging polite smiles and quiet negotiations beneath glittering lights, and Lina stayed close to Victor, observing how effortlessly he commanded attention without demanding it, how people leaned in when he spoke, sensing authority rather than fearing it. And for the first time, she understood that his rage wasn't wild or impulsive. It was controlled, reserved for moments when lines were crossed that could not be ignored. Across the room, an unexpected presence caught her eye: Aaron, standing awkwardly near the bar, clearly out of place, his confidence replaced with nervous energy, and the realization that their worlds had collided so suddenly made her heart pound. But Victor noticed her reaction immediately, following her gaze and understanding without words. And instead of confronting Aaron or creating a scene, Victor simply placed a steady hand at the small of Lina's back, grounding her, silently reminding her that she was not alone and no longer vulnerable. Aaron, spotting them moments later, froze, disbelief washing over his face as he watched Lina standing beside a man whose reputation alone commanded fear and respect. And in that instant, the imbalance of power shifted so clearly that Aaron felt it physically, his chest tightening with regret and insecurity. Yet even then, Lina didn't look at him with anger or longing, only with calm distance, and that indifference cut deeper than any confrontation ever could. As the evening progressed, Aaron gathered the courage to approach, his voice trembling as he tried to apologize again, this time more desperate than before. But Lina met his gaze steadily and told him, quietly and without emotion, that leaving her alone that night had shown her exactly who he was, and that she no longer needed explanations, because clarity was enough. And with that, she turned away, ending the conversation without drama, while Victor watched closely, not intervening, not threatening. Because the moment belonged to Lina alone. Later that night, as they returned to the penthouse, Lina felt an unfamiliar calm settle over her, realizing that closure didn't come from forcing someone to understand your pain, but from understanding your own worth. And Victor, standing beside her as the city lights blurred past, knew that whatever came next would be shaped not by anger or revenge, but by the quiet power of someone who had finally stopped accepting less than they deserved. The days after the gala carried a different energy, lighter yet charged with possibility, and Lina noticed how her thoughts no longer circled endlessly around Aaron or the pain he'd caused, but instead focused on what she wanted next, a question that had felt impossible to ask before, and though uncertainty remained, it no longer frightened her, because she had already survived the moment she once thought would break her. Victor, too, seemed subtly changed, more reflective than usual, spending longer hours at home in the evenings, their conversations stretching late into the night as they discussed ambition, fear, and the quiet cost of power. And Lina began to see beyond the myth surrounding him, recognizing a man who carried responsibility like armor, heavy, but chosen. Someone who understood that strength meant restraint just as much as control. Meanwhile, Aaron's reality continued to crumble, the gala encounter replaying in his mind like a warning he couldn't erase. And when he was officially let go from his job under the guise of restructuring, panic replaced denial, forcing him to confront the consequences he'd long avoided. And for the first time, he questioned whether walking away that night had been an act of freedom or cowardice disguised as honesty. Lina, determined not to hide from the world any longer, began exploring opportunities she'd postponed during her relationship, scheduling interviews, reconnecting with old friends, and even enrolling in a short professional course she'd once been discouraged from pursuing. And Victor supported these choices quietly, offering resources without strings, making it clear that her independence mattered more to him than her dependence. A distinction that deepened her respect for him in ways she hadn't anticipated. One evening, as they shared a simple dinner without staff or ceremony, Lina asked Victor why he'd reacted so strongly to her situation that first night. And for a long moment he said nothing, his gaze fixed on the city beyond the window, before admitting that abandonment was something he'd learned to despise early in life, that he'd watched people he cared for be discarded when they were no longer useful, and that he'd sworn never to become someone who looked away when he had the power to intervene. And Lina listened carefully, understanding that his rage had never been about control or ego, but about principle, about drawing a line that said some actions were unacceptable no matter who committed them. Across town, Aaron made one last attempt to regain control, showing up unexpectedly at Victor Wright's office building, fueled by desperation and resentment, demanding to speak to Lina, convinced she'd been taken from him. But security intercepted him before he reached the upper floors, and though Victor was informed immediately, he chose not to confront Aaron directly, instructing instead that the man be escorted out with a clear warning never to return, a decision rooted not in mercy, but in the belief that relevance was the one thing Aaron no longer deserved. Lina learned about the incident later that night, and instead of fear, she felt a strange sense of finality, realizing that the man who once dominated her emotional world had shrunk into a distant figure whose actions no longer defined her safety or self-worth. And as she stood on the balcony breathing in the cool night air, she felt something close to gratitude for the pain that had forced her to grow, and for the unexpected ally who had shown her that protection didn't have to come at the cost of freedom. Victor joined her quietly, standing at her side without touching, and for a long moment they simply watched the city, two people shaped by different battles yet standing at the same crossroads. And when Lina finally spoke, thanking him not just for what he'd done, but for how he'd done it, Victor nodded once, telling her that strength was contagious, and that watching her reclaim herself had reminded him why boundaries mattered. As the night deepened, Lina realized that whatever lay ahead, whether it involved Victor in her life or not, would be built on choice rather than fear, and that realization filled her with a calm confidence she'd never known before. While somewhere else in the city, Aaron sat alone with the consequences of his decisions, finally understanding that walking away from someone who loved you didn't make you powerful. It only revealed what you lacked. And as the balance between past and future tipped decisively forward, Lina stepped fully into the life she was no longer afraid to claim. Quiet but irreversible shift settled over Lina's life, not marked by dramatic moments or sudden declarations, but by the steady alignment of who she was and who she was becoming. And as weeks passed, the penthouse no longer felt like a place of refuge from pain, but a temporary chapter she would eventually close on her own terms, a realization that brought both comfort and resolve, because she knew now that staying by choice was very different from staying out of need. Victor seemed to sense this turning point as well, never questioning her plans, never suggesting she remain longer than she wished, and instead encouraging her momentum, introducing her to people who could help her professionally, not as favors owed, but as opportunities earned, and Lina approached each interaction with quiet confidence, aware of the power dynamics around her yet no longer intimidated by them. Aaron, on the other hand, drifted through his days in a haze of regret and resentment, watching from a distance as Lina's absence solidified into permanence. And when he finally received confirmation that she had started a new position through one of Victor's connections, the realization struck with brutal clarity that the life he'd dismissed so casually was moving forward without him, a truth that left no room for blame except the kind he wasn't yet ready to accept. Lina's new job demanded focus and creativity, pulling her energy outward instead of inward, and with each challenge she overcame, her sense of capability deepened. Until one evening she returned to the penthouse energized, sharing her first real success with Victor, who listened with genuine interest, his rare smile reflecting pride rather than possession. And in that moment, Lina understood that respect could exist without obligation, that support didn't have to be transactional to be real. Later that night, Lina received one final message from Aaron, longer than the others, stripped of defensiveness, acknowledging his mistakes without excuses, admitting that leaving her alone had been the worst decision of his life. And though the words were sincere, they arrived too late because Lina had already grieved the relationship, already rebuilt herself without him. And instead of responding, she deleted the message, not out of anger, but out of closure. Recognizing that some apologies were meant to be accepted silently and left in the past, Victor noticed the calm in her afterward, the absence of inner conflict that had once weighed heavily on her, and though he never asked what had changed, he understood that a door had finally closed, and that understanding shifted something between them, creating a space not defined by protection or gratitude, but by mutual awareness, the kind that acknowledged possibility without demanding it. One evening, as they shared a rare moment of stillness, Victor spoke honestly about the line he never crossed with people he cared about, explaining that power complicated intention, and that he refused to blur consent with influence, a confession that revealed a vulnerability Lina hadn't expected. And in response, she told him she valued him precisely because he never tried to decide her future for her. And as their eyes met, the unspoken connection between them deepened, not rushed, not claimed. Simply recognized. Across the city, Aaron packed his belongings into boxes, preparing to leave the apartment he could no longer afford, each item a reminder of choices made too easily and consequences that arrived too late. And though he told himself he would start over somewhere new, a part of him understood that some lessons followed you no matter where you went, because growth delayed was growth denied. Lina, meanwhile, began making plans to move into her own place again, not out of necessity, but because independence now felt like an achievement rather than a burden. And when she told Victor, he accepted the news without resistance, offering assistance only if she asked. And that restraint confirmed what she had already come to believe, that whatever bond existed between them was built on respect, not control. On her final night at the penthouse, Lina stood on the balcony one last time, the city spread out before her like a living map of possibility, reflecting on how a moment of abandonment had led her not to destruction, but to clarity, and Victor joined her quietly, thanking her for reminding him that strength could be gentle, that protection didn't require domination, And as they stood side by side, not touching, not promising anything, the future remained unwritten. And for the first time, Lina didn't need certainty to feel secure, because she had learned the most important truth of all, that being left behind didn't diminish her value, it revealed it, and that realization would guide her long after this chapter closed. Lina's life had settled into a rhythm that felt both familiar and entirely new, the kind of quiet stability that only comes after surviving upheaval. And though the nights were still filled with occasional memories of pain, those flashes no longer carried the weight they once did, because she had reclaimed herself in ways that Aaron's abandonment could never undo. Her new apartment, smaller and simpler than the penthouse, reflected that change, stripped of unnecessary luxury yet filled with items she had chosen with care. Books stacked on shelves that bore her favorite titles, a few framed photographs of friends and family who had remained loyal, and little touches of color and warmth that made the space unmistakably hers. And as she walked through it each morning, unpacking boxes and arranging the furniture to her liking, she felt a quiet pride that came from creating a life fully her own, without dependence on anyone else's presence or validation. Work became a sanctuary, a place where her focus and creativity were recognized and valued, and Lina found herself thriving in ways she hadn't imagined possible when her world had been consumed by Aaron's absence. Her colleagues quickly came to rely on her insights and problem-solving, unaware of the battles she had fought to arrive there, and the satisfaction that came from achieving success on her own terms added a new layer to her confidence, one built not on validation from others, but on her own determination and capability. Every project completed, every challenge met, reminded her that she was no longer defined by the moments she had once felt powerless, and that the woman standing in front of mirrors each morning was stronger, wiser, and more self-assured than she had ever been before the night Aaron walked away. Victor remained a presence in her life, though more subtle than before, checking in occasionally with simple messages and invitations that left her space to respond or decline. And Lina found herself appreciating the balance he offered, the respect for her autonomy coupled with unwavering support whenever she needed guidance or reassurance. It was a rare combination she had never experienced before, and it contrasted sharply with Aaron's carelessness, highlighting in every interaction the difference between someone who controlled out of fear and someone who protected out of principle. Their conversations had grown richer, deeper, and more grounded in reality, discussing ambition, past mistakes, personal growth, and the importance of accountability. And Lina realized that Victor's presence had never been about rescuing her, but about reinforcing her strength, a subtle mentorship disguised as companionship, teaching her the value of boundaries, self-respect, and measured action. Aaron's departure from the city brought its own strange closure, though it was entirely unceremonious. He packed up his belongings, saying nothing to Lina, and in the silence left behind, she felt a curious sense of relief rather than triumph, because there was no confrontation, no lingering bitterness necessary. The absence of someone who had once caused chaos had become its own form of resolution. In the weeks following, news of Aaron's struggles trickled in through mutual acquaintances, yet Lina felt nothing but detached understanding. She knew the lessons he had learned were his own to carry, and that the growth she had experienced had nothing to do with his failures or attempts at reconciliation. The city, once so full of personal drama and emotional upheaval, became a backdrop for her life instead of a stage for her suffering, and every step she took forward felt deliberate and deliberate alone. One afternoon, Lina ventured out for errands and found herself in a cafe she had frequented during her early days in the city, the familiar smell of coffee and the low hum of conversation creating a sense of comfort she hadn't realized she missed. It was here that she saw Victor sitting at a corner table, reviewing papers quietly, and as their eyes met, she smiled naturally, recognizing the unspoken trust and understanding that had developed between them, a bond not defined by dependence, but by mutual respect. They shared coffee, discussing work, life, and the small but meaningful choices that define their days. And when Victor spoke of giving people the space to grow while remaining quietly present for them, Lina realized that he had modeled a type of strength she could now apply to herself. Firm yet gentle, influential yet never overbearing. In the evenings, Lina spent time on her balcony, looking out over the city lights with a sense of quiet triumph, the skyline no longer feeling overwhelming but inspiring, a reminder that the world was vast and that her place in it had been earned through resilience and self-determination. She reflected on the night Aaron left her, on the rain-soaked streets, the fear, and the despair, and now those memories felt like a distant prelude, a necessary chapter that had guided her to this moment of clarity. She understood that her life would always carry echoes of the past, but those echoes no longer dictated her emotions. They were lessons, reminders of her own capacity to recover, rebuild, and thrive. Months passed, and Lina began to make plans for the future on her own terms, pursuing opportunities she had once postponed, reconnecting with friends she had neglected, and even considering travel she had dreamed of but never dared to attempt. Each decision was made deliberately, without hesitation, a tangible proof of the autonomy she had gained, and each success, no matter how small, reinforced her understanding that her life was no longer contingent on anyone else's actions or approval. Victor remained a supportive observer, occasionally offering guidance or insight, never insisting on influence or control, and Lina came to appreciate not just his power, but the integrity with which he wielded it, a reflection of what she now valued in herself. One quiet evening, as the city glimmered beneath her balcony, Lina received a note from a friend praising her for the change they could see in her. Calm, confident, and independent. Yet Lina knew that the transformation was less about external validation and more about internal recognition. She had survived abandonment, had confronted the chaos of loss, and had emerged intact, fully aware that the strength she now carried would protect her from being defined by others' choices again. Victor called later that night, and in their brief conversation, they laughed over a shared memory from months prior, a simple exchange that carried no weight of obligation, yet spoke volumes of the quiet trust they had cultivated, the kind of connection that respected boundaries while celebrating growth. As Lina prepared for bed that night, she reflected on the trajectory of her past months, recognizing the distance traveled, not measured in miles or possessions, but in emotional and mental resilience, in the capacity to act with autonomy and clarity, and in the ability to step forward without the weight of past betrayal dragging her backward. She understood that love and respect, when paired correctly, nurtured growth rather than dependence, and that the night she had once feared would define her life had instead become the catalyst for a self she would never again compromise. She looked out over the city one last time before sleeping, smiling softly, because she had discovered the most important truth. That being left behind didn't weaken her, it revealed her power, and that power would guide every step of the life she was now free to create, wholly and unapologetically, on her own terms.